Welcome to UGC's E-Pathshala lecture series on computer science. The paper is about introduction to visualization, visualization techniques, and in today's module we are going to look at dimensionality reduction techniques in visualization. So the learning objectives of today's module are to introduce the concepts of high dimensional visualization, to learn the different types of high dimensional visualizations that are available, to learn about the various dimensionality reduction techniques, and to learn about the applications of dimensionality reduction techniques in visualization. Introduction. The term high dimensional data visualization and high dimensional visualization are often used interchangeably. Visualization of high dimensional data is different from high dimensional visualization. Visualization try to project the n-dimensional data onto two dimensions. The dimensionality of the physical medium, which is two dimension, and or the logical representation of the data may differ. So when we look at the high dimensional visualization, that is the high dimensional visualization is totally different from high dimensional data visualization. If we look at the high dimensional visualizations, we have 2D and 3D scatter plots, we have matrix of scatter plots, heat maps, height maps, table lengths, survey plots, and iconographic displays. So let us have a look at each and every individual high dimensional visualization in detail. The first one is a 2D and 3D scatter plot. A scatter plot is a point projection, usually it is affine in nature, point projection of the data onto a 2D or 3-dimensional space, which is represented on the screen in a classic XY format or an XYZ format. This is the most commonly used data visualization method. So here are the examples for 2D and 3D scatter plot. This is a 2-dimensional scatter plot where you have the x-axis and the y-axis. So we have the spatial length as well as the width, the sepal length as well as the sepal width, which are represented in the x and the y-axis. The same data set is represented in the inside the 3-dimensional box, where you have the x-axis, y-axis, and the z-axis, where the z-axis represents the petal height. The next set of visualization is a matrix of scatter plot. A matrix of scatter plot is an array of scatter plots which display all possible pairwise combinations of dimensions or coordinates. Given k set of variables, the scatter plot matrices are formed by creating k rows and k columns. Each row and column defines a single scatter plot as such. The scatter plots can also be positioned in a non-array format, maybe in a circular or hexagonal format. One can visually link the features of one scatter plot with the features on another scatter plot, which greatly increases its power. So an example of a matrix of scatter plot is shown here. So if you look at this scatter plot, the data is about the pollution data, which talks about the various areas, the pollution in the it is the pollution data, wherein you can look at the type of pollution that is available, say the lead pollution or the potassium or the iron or the sulfur dioxide, which is represented in the matrix of scatter plot. So this sample scatter plot was generated from the pollution data, which was collected by the NIST chemist Lloyd Curry. If we are really interested in a particular variable, we can scan the row and column for that particular variable. So if you look at iron, if you want to know the data with respect to iron, so you need to look at the row as well as a column with respect to iron pollutant. If we are interested in finding the strongest relationship, then we can scan all the plots and then determine which variables are related to each other. So thereby, using these kind of matrix of scatter plot, it is possible for us to easily visualize or get the relationship between each and every individual pollutant data in this case, as well as we can visualize the relationship between different sets of data as such. The next type of visualization are the heat maps. This is an array of cells where each cell is colored based on some data value or a function on the data. The method is a generalization of a scatter plot where the points are grid cells and each cell is colored in nature. There are many variants, namely the clustered image map, heat maps, patch map, which are all synonyms to the heat maps as such. So this is an example of a heat map of the iris dataset. So if you look at it, this represents a type. The blue, the grey and the yellow represents a type. The sepal length is of, there are 3 different types basically. If you look at the sepal length, the variation in the types with respect to sepal length is shown here. The variation in the types with respect to sepal width is shown here. The variation in the types with respect to petal length and petal width is also shown in the data. So this is a heat map which is being generated out of the iris data set. The next kind of visualization are the height maps. A height map is a further extension of a heat map with the grid represented as a height instead by a specific color. Making the cell size small can generate an almost continuous map as such. An example of a height map is the theme view, where the topics of the themes within a set of the documents are shown as a relief map of natural terrain. So here, if this is a height map of document themes that is generated by the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. So here we can look at the themes that are represented by the various documents. The different themes with their heights represent the importance of each and every theme inside that document. So if you look at it clearly, we can see that there are various themes that are being represented, and the height represents the importance of the theme in that specific document. The next type of visualization is a table lens. The table lens takes a spreadsheet and allows each cell to be displayed optionally using a line whose length depends on the numerical value of the cell and whose color can represent some other attribute of the data. This provides for both a symbolic as well as a graphical representation of a data within a single table. This can be viewed as an intermediate view of the data between a pure spreadsheet and a heat map where each item is represented as a number. So the table lens can be represented as an intermediate view between a pure spreadsheet as well as a heat map. So this is an example table lens wherein you can see there are a set of rows that are being selected, and this table lens view shows the sales data set. So you have a specific set of data that are being selected. So each and every data represents a particular cell in an Excel sheet. The value is also represented. The color represents some specific attribute of that data. So this is an example of a table lens. The next kind of visualization are the survey plots. The survey plots are a systematic sampling technique which is being used on the land surfaces for laying out sample plots within a rectangular grid to conduct the forest inventory or agricultural research basically. So this survey methodology is typically used to collect information about seedlings or shrubs or invasive species, signs of wildlife, need for fertilization, the timber species count and other similar type of data related to agricultural or related to some kind of land layout data. So this is an example of a survey plot. So this picture was taken from the Millennium Galaxy catalog. So this the MGC survey region is indicated by a thick green line along the deck is equal to 0 line basically. So due to the setup of the wide field camera, we can see the detailed survey geometry is actually quite complicated because the setup of the wide field camera is in such a way that it is not possible for us to view the detailed survey of the entire data, the entire land basically. The next set of visualization are the iconographic displays. So if we look at these iconographic display, we can see that an icon mapping of several parameters from a census dataset of New England technicians and engineers are shown as an iconographic display here. The various data dimension values are mapped to the parameters of the icon such as the length of the limb or the rotation angle of the limb, etc. So, the census data is actually mapped on to the various dimensions or the various parameters of the icon such as the each and every limb of the icon. So, these represents an iconographic display. So, if we see the limbs are connected in such a manner, or all the 4 parts of the organs are connected in such a manner based on the data values as such. The next set of visualization are the parallel coordinates. The parallel coordinates use parallel axis instead of perpendicular to represent the dimensions of a multidimensional data set. A vertical line is used here for the projection of each dimension or attribute, but the maximum and minimum values of each dimension usually scaled to the upper and lower boundaries on those vertical lines. A polyline made up of n minus l lines at the appropriate dimensional values connects the axis to represent an n-dimensional plot. So, this is an example of a parallel coordinate. So, this is a parallel coordinate display of the iris data set. So, here you can see the sepal length, sepal width, petal width and the type each are represented as separate perpendicular lines here, and the data is actually represented using the parallel lines. There are various dimensionality reduction techniques available. Till now we have been looking at various high dimensional visualization. So, in the case of high dimensional visualization, it is possible for us to visualize almost the n dimensions of the entire data set. In some cases, there is a need to reduce the number of dimensions of the data set as such. So, in such cases, we need to go in for some kind of dimensionality reduction methods or techniques by which it is possible for us to reduce the dimension of the data as such and then represent the data in the form of a visual. So, there are various dimensionality reduction methods that are available to reduce the dimension of the data set as well as to reduce the dimension in the visualization as such. So, some of the dimensionality reduction methods are principal component analysis or PCA, which is a simple linear method that try to preserve the global distances between the various data points. Multidimensional scaling or MDS, which tries to preserve the global distances as such. Sammon's projection, a variation of this MDS, pays more attention to short distances as such. Isometric mapping of data manifolds or an Isomap is a graph-based method which is similar to that of MDS. Other than this, we have curvilinear component analysis or CCA, which is an MDS-like method that tries to preserve the distances in small neighborhoods. Then we have the maximum variance unfolding technique, which maximizes the variance with the constraint that the short distances are preserved as such. Next, we have the self-organizing map or the SOM, a flexible and scalable method that tries a surface that passes through all the data points. Then we have the independent component analysis or ICA, a fast linear method which is suitable for some applications to reduce the dimension. Then we have the NERV or the neighbor retrieval visualizer, which was originally developed at the HUT basically. So, these are certain dimensionality reduction techniques, and now let us have a look at various dimensionality reduction techniques in detail. The first dimensionality reduction technique that we are going to look at is the principal component analysis or the PCA. The principal component analysis or PCA involves a mathematical procedure that tries to transform a number, possibly correlated variables, into a smaller number of uncorrelated variables called as the principal components. So, if you look at the data set, you have the data here, wherein you have functionality 1, which is represented by x1, x2, x3 up to x8, and similarly you have functionality 2 with various data set. Now, the entire data set can be transformed into another way by applying this PCA, so that the entire dimension of the data as such is being reduced. So, in the principal component analysis, the first principal component accounts for as much of the variability in the data as possible, and each succeeding component accounts for as much of the remaining variability as possible. So, this entire data set is being transformed into various principal components, basically the PC1, PC2, PC3, etc. So, the first principal component actually accounts for the variability in the data set, and each succeeding component as such also accounts for the remaining variability as far as possible. A multivariate data matrix in PCA analysis permits us to reduce the dimensionality of the entire given input data set. This reduction in dimensionality now helps us to identify the strongest patterns in the data, helps us to capture most of the variability of the data by a small fraction of the total set of dimensions, and eliminate much of the noise in the data, making it beneficial for both the data mining as well as for some kind of data analysis algorithms. So, from a set of n correlated descriptors, we can derive a set of n uncorrelated descriptors, which are called as the principal components. Each principal component is a suitable linear combination of all the original descriptors as such. The PCA reduces the information dimensionality that is often needed from the vast arrays of data in a way so that there is minimal loss of information as such. So, here if you see, you have the descriptors m components and n descriptors as such in the n dimensional data space, which is being applied using the data matrix. It is possible for us to transform them into various PC components as such. So, here is a diagram. If you see, the m components are the n descriptors which are represented in the n dimensional data space, which is a data matrix which consists of latent variables or response matrices, are applied by or given to the dimensionality reduction technique, applying the principal component eigenvector space, where each principal component is described as a linear combination of the weighted contribution of each variable. Then we need to seek the patterns of, we need to bin it or cluster it, where each data point represents a correlation position of the component as influenced by the descriptor. So, we try to seek patterns of clustering in the PCA space, which may involve other statistical and data mining algorithms or techniques, and integrate these to material science interpretation for some kind of knowledge discovery. So, this is represented in the figure as such. So, this is an example data set wherein the principal component analysis is applied over the data set to get various principal components. So, we have the first projection, second and the second. In the next figure we have the first and the third projection, and then we in the fourth figure we have the second projection as well as the third projection. The first figure represents the index value with respect to the eigenvalues. The next kind of dimensionality reduction technique is the multidimensional scaling approach, which is also called as MDS. This MDS or a multidimensional scaling is a means of visualizing the level of similarity of the individual cases of a dataset. It refers to a set of related ordination techniques used in information visualization, in particular to display the information contained in a distance matrix. A multidimensional scaling or MDS algorithm aims to place each object in the n-dimensional space such that the distance between the object distances are preserved as well as possible. Each object is an assigned coordinates in each of the n dimension as such. So, here is an example of the MDS. MDS tries to preserve the large distances at the expense of smaller ones. Hence, it can collapse some small distances on the expense of preserving the larger distances. A projection is trustworthy or precise if k closest neighbors of a sample in the projection are also close by in the original space as such. A projection also preserves the original neighbors, that is recalled, if all k closest neighbors of a sample in the original space are also done close by in the projection as such. So, here is a multidimensional scaling solution for an experimental for a 28 experimental data set as such. So, we can see the correlation between the data points by with respect to the distances they are being placed on the graph as such. The next kind of visualization is a Sammon mapping technique. This is another dimensionality reduction technique wherein the Sammon mapping reduces the dimensionality of a large set of real valued vectors which are representing points in some high dimensional space and preserve the structure, that is the geometric relations between the original data points in this case will be intact. Sammon mapping is designed to minimize the differences between corresponding interpoint distances in the two spaces. That is, a transformation is regarded as preferable if it conserves to the greatest extent the distance between each pair of points. It also ensures that the mapping does not affect the topology as such. So, this is a very good example of a Sammon mapping. So, if you see, this is an example of a 3-dimensional data set consisting of 8 sinusoids on the surface of the cylinder. So, the entire data set lies on a 2 manifold and we should be able to obtain a 2-dimensional projection which preserves the structural details. In the B figure, this is a result of applying the principal component analysis, which is a linear projection to the data set. And here we can note that the individual sinusoid intersects basically, thus the topology of the original data has not been preserved in this case. So, if you look at the C figure, the result of applying the Sammon mapping to the data set, which is given in A, is shown in C, which yields a somewhat different result to that of PCA. There are fewer intersections between the sinusoids, though still there are some kind of intersections, but very fewer intersections when compared to that of PCA. And this is the final one is idealized nonlinear projection of the data with a cylinder being unrolled and which reveals the true structure most clearly. So, however, this kind of Sammon mapping is unlikely to achieve this particular form as a topology is not preserved along the cut corresponding to the top and bottom edges of the plot as such. Isomaps. Isomaps are another kind of technique and it is one representative of the isometric mapping methods, and this extends the multidimensional scaling approach by incorporating the geodesic distances, that is the shortest path imposed by a weighted graph. This MDS performs low dimensional embedding based on the pairwise distances between the data points, which is also measured using straight line in a Euclidean distance, whereas Isomap is distinguished by its use of geodesic distance induced by a neighborhood graph embedded in the classical scaling. This is done to incorporate manifold structure in the resulting embedding. So, the Isomap defines the geodesic distance to be the sum of edge weights along the shortest path between two nodes. The top n eigenvectors of the geodesic distance matrix represent the coordinates in the new n-dimensional Euclidean space as such. So, this is an example of an Isomap of a data set. So, if you look at the data set, the Swiss rule data set, which illustrates how the Isomap exploits the geodesic path for nonlinear dimensionality reduction. If you look at the A figure, it is for two arbitrary points circled on a nonlinear manifold. So, here are the 2 points that are seen on the nonlinear manifolds as such, and the Euclidean distance in the high dimensional input space may not be accurately reflect the intrinsic similarity. Whereas in the B figure, these are the 2 points. So, the neighborhood graph constructed in step 1 of the Isomap allows an approximation to the true geodesic path to be computed efficiently in step 2 as the shortest path in G. Now, the C figure represents the 2-dimensional embedding recovered by the Isomap in step 3, which best preserves the shortest path distances in the neighborhood graph that is being overlaid basically. The straight lines in the embedding, that is your blue line, represents the simpler and cleaner approximation to the true geodesic path and to the corresponding graph path basically. So, this picture gives a clear distance matrix as such. The next kind of visualization is a curvilinear component analysis. Curvilinear component analysis looks for the configuration of points in the output space that tries to preserve the original distances as much as possible while focusing on small distances in the output space. This is converse to the Sammon mapping, which tries to focus on small distances in the original space. So, then this kind of CCA acts as an iterative learning algorithm and starts with focus on larger distances. Then it tries to gradually change a focus to small distances. The small distance information will overwrite the large distance information if compromises between the two has to be made. So, this is an example of the curvilinear analysis. We can see a mapping of two interlaced rings. The input space is given in 3 dimensions, that is shown in figure A. In figure B, the two output space which is constrained to 2 dimensions gives the mapping that is found. And in figure C, we can see a neural network cuts the entire rings to put them on the plane as such. The next kind of dimensionality reduction technique is a maximum variance unfolding technique. This is a semi-definite embedding technique, or a maximum variance unfolding is an algorithm that uses semi-definite programming to perform nonlinear dimensionality reduction of high-dimensional vectorial input dataset. This MVU can be viewed as a nonlinear generalization of the principal component analysis. The maximum variance unfolding is a member of the mainful learning family, which also include algorithms such as Isomap and locally linear embedding as such. So, in manifold learning, the input data set is assumed to be sampled from a low dimensional manifold that is embedded inside a higher dimensional vectorial space as such. The main intuition behind the MVU is to exploit the local linearity of the manifolds and create a mapping that tries to preserve the local neighborhoods at every point of the underlying manifold. MVU creates a mapping from the high dimensional input vectors to some low dimensional Euclidean vector space in the following steps. So, first a neighborhood graph is being created, and then each input is connected with the k nearest input vectors, and all k nearest neighbors are connected with each other. If the data is sampled well enough, the resulting graph is a discrete approximation of the underlying manifold. The neighborhood graph is unfolded with the help of semi-definite programming. So, this is an example of the maximum variance unfolding technique. We have the query image, and then we have two images A and B, which are images of teapots. The pixel distances versus the perceptual distance is shown here. As measured with the mean square difference of the pixel intensities, we can find that image A is closer to the query image than image B, despite the fact that the view in image A involves a full 180 degrees of rotation. So, this is a maximum variance unfolding technique, two-dimensional representation of n is equal to 400 images of a teapot viewed from different angles in the plane. Circular arrangement reflects the underlying rotational degree of freedom, and in this representation, image B is closer to the query image than image A, unlike the previous figure as such. Next comes the self-organizing maps. Self-organizing maps, or SOM, is a type of artificial neural network that is trained using unsupervised learning to produce a low-dimensional discretized representation of the input space of the training samples, which are called as a map. The SOMs are different from other artificial neural network as they apply competitive learning as opposed to error correction learning, which is like backpropagation with gradient descent, and they also use a neighborhood function to preserve the topological properties of the input space. A SOM consists of components called nodes or neurons. Each node has a weight vector of same dimension as the input data vector and a position in the map space. The usual arrangement of node is a two-dimensional rectangular spacing in a hexagonal or rectangular grid. Self-organizing map describes a mapping from higher dimensional input space to a lower dimensional map space. The procedure for placing a vector from data space onto the map is to find the node with the class closest weight vector to the data space vector. So, we have the following screenshots which represents a self-organizing map after 10, 20, 40, 80 and 160 steps of training patterns. As the training proceeds, we can see the grid structure in which the neurons are organized becomes more and more visible, and finally the grid is being unfolded. So this is 20, 40, 80, and as the number of iterations increases, as the training increases, we can see finally the grid unfolds and it's shown as a two-dimensional grid as such. Next one is the independent component analysis. It is a member of class of blind source separation method. The success of this ICE depends on one key assumption, that is the nature of the physical world. This assumption is that independent variables or signals are generated by different underlying physical process. If two signals are independent, then the value of one signal cannot be used to predict anything about the corresponding value of the other signal. As it is not usually possible to measure the output of a single physical process, it follows that most measured signal must be mixtures of independent signal. So given such a set of measured signals, that is mixtures, ICA works by finding a transformation of those mixtures which produce independent signal components on the assumption that each of these independent component is associated with a different physical process. So this is an example of an independent component analysis, a scatter plot of Australian crabs dataset. PCA here, applying PCA cannot identify the clusters. In B, we apply the ICA, and in C, we apply the ICA after the PCA, which clearly identifies the clusters in the dataset. The final visualization is a neighbor retrieval visualizer, which also helps in reducing the dimension. The neighbor retrieval finds similar data based on similarities shown on the display. So the fundamental trade-off between the precision and recall of information retrieval can then be quantified in visualizations as such. The user needs to give the relative cost of missing similar points versus the retrieving dissimilar points, after which the total cost can be measured. The method NERV produces an optimal visualization by minimizing the cost. So this is an example of a 3D dataset sampled from the surface of the sphere. The glyph shape shows the 3D coordinates of each point. So the sphere has been cut open and it is being folded out. This embedding eliminates a false positive. There are some misses because points on different sides of the tear end up far away from each other in B. And B minimizes a number of misses by squashing the sphere flat. This increases a false positive because points on opposite sides of the sphere are mapped close to each other when it is being squashed as a sphere flat. So finally, if you look at the summary, in today's session, we have looked at various high dimensional visualization techniques as such, and then the different types of high dimensional visualization. What are the various dimensionality reduction techniques that are available, and the application of dimensionality reduction technique in visualization as such has been studied in this module. Thank you.